Today, we're going to talk about something that I don't want to talk about. In fact, if I chose topics, it would not be this topic. I preach about stuff not because I want to preach about it, but we preach through entire books of the Bible. We're making our way through the entire Gospel of Mark. And so sometimes we will hit things that are hard. Sometimes we'll hit things that you might disagree with. And you might even get a little upset with me about how I approach this issue, or about what was said, or about the application of it. I want you to know, though, that I'm trying to teach you what Jesus says and why he says it. This is what I'm not trying to do. I'm not using the Bible to condemn anyone. I'm not using the Bible to point a finger at you and say, look at how you're messing up, or someone that you know is messing up, or someone in your family is messing up. I'm using the Bible to say, hey, this is God's best for us. All of us fall short, but these are lessons that we can learn in order to improve our lives. God says things to us for important reasons. So we want to explore that today as we deal with a very, very difficult topic. Yes, even a topic that is controversial in this day and age. Jesus talks about it 2,000 years ago. So with me, turn in your Bibles to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. The Gospel of Mark, chapter 10. We have finished all of chapter 9. That was a long chapter to deal with. Now we're moving on to chapter 10, and we're going to talk about what Jesus mentions here on the subject of divorce. Let me ask you, how many of you know someone who has gotten a divorce? Okay, it's most of you in the auditorium. How many of you have someone in your family that has gotten divorced? A lot of you, okay? My own brother, this has fallen upon. In the United States, statistically, the divorce rate is roughly 37%. So it's not as high as people expect it to be. There are some that were saying for a while that the divorce rate is up to 50%. But here's the problem. The divorce rate is 37% as well in the church as outside the church. There is no difference in our culture between what is happening in the church and what is happening outside the church, which means we're looking a whole lot more like the world than the world is noticing a difference in us, which is why we need to talk about these issues, which is why Jesus in his Bible brings up these important issues and addresses them in a way that helps us understand what we need to think in relationship to this topic. So let me begin with a quick story. Billy Graham, one of the most famous evangelists of all time, preached all over the country. And oftentimes, his wife, Ruth, would go with him. And as they were preaching, many times you would get reporters and you would get journalists that would come up to them and want to know how they were doing, want to know what's happening, want to see the results of his various crusades. And Billy Graham probably has led more people to Christ than anyone else on the face of the planet. Now, one of the reporters came up, not to Billy Graham, but to Ruth. And he asked Ruth, you're married to this guy. He's traveling all the time. Is it easy to stay united, to stay together? And she said, no, of course, we have our challenges like any other couple does. And the reporter got curious and he said, have you ever thought of getting a divorce? And she immediately fired back, absolutely not. I will never divorce my husband. Murder, maybe. Divorce, no. Where I think that's probably taking things a little too far. Ruth definitely had a sense of humor. But divorce has been a part of marriages since the Old Testament law. This is nothing new, but it's not part of God's design. So let's take a look at divorce, a hard look at divorce, and see what we can learn how God feels about marriage. But again, I want to remind you, if you have had a divorce in your family, if you have been divorced, if you know someone that's struggling through a divorce, this is not me saying what a bad person you are. I have only sympathy and sorrow for people that have gone through such a horrible event in their life. But for those of you who are married, the goal of this is to help you want to stay married because of God's design. And if you are divorced, again, I'm so sorry that you went through that. Maybe if you marry again, this can be something that can help and admonish you. Now, I know a lot of you are youth, and many of you are thinking to yourselves, I'm not married. I'm not going to be married in like a decade or more. Why in the world should I know about divorce now? The answer is simple. Just like when you are deciding whether or not you want to take drugs, or whether or not you want to engage in sex before marriage, or whether or not you want to yield to temptation, the goal for you is to make your decisions now, not in the heat of the moment. Because in the heat of the moment, the emotions will rise and will persuade you to do something that God might not want you to do. But if you make your decision now, your decision might be, I'm not going to get divorced. Your decision might be, I'm not going to disobey God or his rules. I want to follow him. It will help you to stay faithful to that commitment when all your emotions are saying the exact opposite. Does that make sense? So this is why, even for youth, speaking about divorce is very important. And Mark thinks it's so important because this little theme here in the middle of chapter 10 is sandwiched into other themes that are parallel, meaning that what Mark has done is created a thematic chiasm, the meat of his sandwich, of all of these various themes ranging from leadership to Christ's death and teaching about his death and resurrection. He wants us to understand the importance of how God views family. So let's take a look at Mark chapter 10, start in verse 1, and we'll read all the way through verse 12. Okay? Mark chapter 10, verse 1. And he left there, and he went into the region of Judea and beyond the Jordan, and crowds gathered to him. Again and again, as was custom, he taught them. This time, the Pharisees came up in order to test him. And they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And Jesus answered them, what did Moses command you? They said, well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus said to them, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. And in the house, the disciples asked him again about the matter. And he said to them, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. That's some very bold and often we feel it's harsh words from Jesus. So much so that many people kind of skip this text because they don't want to think about this. They don't want to view divorce, especially in our society, since it is so prevalent, as such a black and white issue. But here's the problem, church. Are we going to take what Jesus says at face value and accept his authority in our life? Or are we going to treat the Bible kind of like a buffet, and we're going to say, I like a little bit of this. Ooh, that tastes good. I like that part of the gospel, but we're going to leave a majority of it alone, saying, well, I don't know about that. If we want to be followers of Christ, we have to be able to accept all that he teaches and try our best to apply all that he teaches, even though some of what he teaches is astronomically difficult, this being one of them. If you are in a home where you just love your spouse and everything is rainbows and buttercups and roses and all kinds of butterflies and flowers that just light your way every time you look at your beloved, congratulations, you have won the lottery. But the overwhelming majority of marriages have struggles. Why? Because you're two different people. My wife and I constantly don't see eye to eye on all kinds of stuff. Some of it is because I'm a man and she's a woman. Some of it is because we're from two unique different cultures. Others of it is simply because we have different views. We are different people. And if she agreed with me on everything, one of us is not necessary. Make sense? So the Bible uses our spouse in order to sharpen us, in order to sanctify us, in order to polish off some of our rough edges, in order to challenge and provoke us in the way that we should go. And that's not an easy thing. So the people of Israel were given an ability to divorce. And obviously, in what Jesus was teaching, the issues of family came up. And so the Pharisees come out to poke Jesus on this issue, to provoke him to try to say something that might get the crowd really, really upset. So why? Because they're jealous. Jesus, a nobody from the nowhere town of Nazareth, is getting constant crowds flocking out to him. He's been mostly working in Capernaum, but now he's moved down south into the Judea area. He's on the eastern side of the Jordan River, and yet crowds upon crowds upon crowds are still flocking to him, still listening to his teaching, and they're trusting in some of the things that he is saying rather than trying to obey all the technical laws of the Pharisees. And that's making them jealous. So they go out. They go out to try to test him, to try to see if they can't get him into some form of trap. And so they ask him this very difficult question. Is it permitted for a man to divorce a wife? Now, why is it such a difficult question? Because Moses allowed a divorce, but Moses didn't instruct people to get divorced. So they were figuring they could get him into a catch-22. If Jesus said, yes, it is permitted, then they could try to nail him and say, aha, isn't it God's design not to get divorced? Right? But if he said, no, one shouldn't get divorced, aha, didn't the law say that we are allowed to get divorced? So they were expecting a debate. Jesus has a way of treating people in the perfect way to avoid useless arguments. And what did Jesus do? Jesus fired back with a question. He's challenging them because he wants us to be able to see. Do you think these people really care about the widow or the orphan? Do you think they really care about what the law says? No, these are the very people that are not respecting their parents when they're old. They're giving money to the temple in order to line their own pockets as that money comes back to them, rather than supporting their mom and dad who can no longer work and need that financial assistance. These are the people that are not caring for other people. They're not loving other people as themselves, and they're not really loving the Lord, their God, with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength. What they're doing is loving the law and all the extra rules that were put on top of the law that they could stand and say, well, hey, you're not doing that. And hey, you're not doing that. And hey, you need to watch this. And hey, you need to obey that. They love power. They don't love people. And that's a very, very important distinction. So Jesus sees exactly what's happening. He sees this catch-22 occur right in real time. And rather than entering into debate, he fires back, answering their question with a question. What did Moses command you? See that? Now Jesus doesn't have to directly answer. And these Pharisees are on the hook because they're supposed to know the law, which means they're going to have to reply and say, well, this is what the law teaches. And then Jesus can interact with them. The man says, well, Moses permitted a book of or a bill of divorce. What does that mean? In Israel, you could end a marriage in a multiple of ways. One of the ways you could end a marriage, especially if your spouse had done something wrong like commit adultery, is you could grab your spouse, take her, because usually this was done by men, not by women, take her into the middle of the Sanhedrin, say in front of the Sanhedrin publicly, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, and it's done. You're divorced. And they would probably try to ask you why. You would indicate that your spouse has broken the rules, she has cheated on you, there's been some breach of trust, and that was a way to end the marriage very publicly and very disgracefully. Now, most men don't want to treat their wives that way. Praise God. Right? So most men would not do that first option. They would choose option number 2. And option number 2 was I would get a friend. And I would get maybe a leader in the synagogue. And I would invite them over to my house and I would tell them, I'm sorry, I just can't make this marriage work. Here are my reasons why. They would say, you're right. You should probably divorce your spouse. And they would write together what we would call a bill of divorce. It was just a little bit of a scroll. It explained the reasons why the marriage was to be terminated. And then you and your 3 friends, or your 2 witnesses, would take wax and you would seal that bill closed. You would then go to your spouse, you would hand them the letter and say, I'm sorry, our marriage is over. And if she wanted to know the reasons why, she could break the seal and read the bill. If she didn't, then she could just take the bill, go back to her family and say, I've been divorced. Here's the bill. And then the marriage is over. This is done privately so that people weren't hurt or people weren't treated with such disrespect as taking them in front of the synagogue or taking them in front of the Sanhedrin and publicly saying, I divorce you. This was to make it more of a personal, hurtful manner. Moses permitted that. They knew it. Jesus knew it. God allowed it to happen. But is it what he wanted? That becomes the ultimate question that we have to ask. But before we answer that question, I just have to point out what Jesus did here was brilliant. Because rather than engaging in arguments with people, sometimes you just need to feed them a little bit of an opportunity to enter more into the argument than you, and you give them just enough rope, usually to hang themselves, right? Let them tell you a little bit more about what they think. Ask questions. So what Jesus recognized is that the Pharisees were engaged in something similar to what we refer to in debate as a pluriunum interrogationum. What is that? That's a fancy way of saying a question that's kind of pointed, where there are some possible unproved assertions embedded in the question that make it very difficult to answer. For example, a pluriunum interrogationum could be this. You might come up to me and say, so, Pastor Daniel, when did you stop beating your wife? Now, what's the assumption? That I'm beating my wife. Has it ever been proven? No, but there's no good way to answer that. Because if I say, I haven't, what does that mean? I keep beating her. right? That's a problem question. So what you have to do is recognize the question for what it is and say, I'm sorry, that's a logical fallacy. It's a per unum interrogationem. You haven't proven that I ever beat my wife. You're asserting it in the question. Make sense? Now, Jesus doesn't identify the Latin phrase of per unum interrogationem because that hasn't really been invented yet. What Jesus does do is, rather than step into the controversy, Jesus answers the charge with another question in order to make them clarify what their position is. That removes the sting. Let me give you a couple examples of how this can work, especially in today's hypercharged argumentative strategy. Let's say someone came up to you and said, I want to talk about the problem of abortion. And they say to you this, because they know that you're a Christian and that they know that most Christians don't think abortion is right. We believe that abortion actually is murder, and we'd love to see abortion stop, right? Everybody agree with me? We're all on the same page? Okay, now you guys are still staring at me like, oh, is he really going there? Okay, yes, I'm going there, okay? Now, what if they came to you and they said, well, don't you believe that a woman has a right to control the medical decisions of her own body? That is a per unum interrogationem, because the moment you say no, then it's like, oh, you fascist, right? You misogynist, you bigot, you sexist. And they will label you as all kinds of horrible names because you're trying to protect human life. Make sense? So what do? Respond to that question with a question. That's interesting that you would phrase your question that way. So tell me, when does the fetus inside the mother become a person? And they might look at you as like, oh, huh? Because they've never considered that question. And you can explain a little bit more. You see, you said that the woman has a right to control her own body. I agree. But if the fetus is a person, then it's a separate body. So she's not controlling her own body, she's controlling somebody else. So when does the fetus become a person? And now they're stuck because they don't have a good answer to that argument. And if they ever say, well, I think maybe when it's born, or I think some other time when it's viable, it becomes a person. There are responses to those arguments. If you want to read those responses, you can turn to Dr. Scott Ray's book, Moral Choices. And I did a sermon on this very topic of abortion. You can go to our YouTube channel, like and subscribe when you're there. And then you can be able to see that sermon where I lay out how a fetus is a person from the very beginning. Make sense? But if you answer a question with a question, you've now diffused the tension because you're no longer a bigot. You're asking them to clarify what their argument is. You want to do it again? Here's another issue. What about, same topic of abortion, what about in cases of rape and incest? Don't you think it's okay to have an abortion then? Again, respond to the question with a question. Here's the question I would ask. So do you want the few to justify the whole? They're going to again ask what? How? Okay. How many abortions take place because of rape and incest? What do you think? If you could just shout out a percentage, what do you think the percentage is of abortions that are for the reason of rape and incest? 1%? I heard 5%. It's less than 1%. It's less than 1%. So of the 100 abortions, less than one. Of the 1,000 abortions, it's like one or two that are because of rape and incest. It is a rarity. And I would go so far as to say, hey, let's find some common ground here. I'm willing to permit abortion for rape and incest if you're willing to stop all other abortions. What do you say? What do you think they're going to respond? No, because they want the exception to justify the whole. Make sense? But don't engage in a fight. Because if you're engaging in a fight, you're only going to increase tensions, you're only going to increase the divide, and people are never going to come to agreement. Respond as Jesus did with a question. Now suddenly, the power of their argument and position has been diffused, and you can talk about real issues. I want to stop as many divorces or many abortions as I possibly can. I'd also like to stop as many divorces as I possibly can. But I understand that these are tough and they're challenging. But we as Christians have to begin to think like Jesus. How do I diffuse the argument rather than just try to win the argument? Now, Jesus then begins to make a series of very important claims regarding abortion. Or not abortion, sorry. I'm still stuck there. Thank you, Siri. No. Okay. It never rains till it pours. Jesus begins to explain the godly understanding of divorce. So once he has... I didn't do it either. Demon be gone. Okay? So he begins with three very powerful charges that he levels at the Pharisees, not condemning them, but explaining why God did what he did and why divorce is so bad. Okay? Charge number one, Jesus says this. He wrote this command because of the hard-heartedness, because of your hard-heartedness. What in the world is Jesus saying by leveling such a statement? The reason is this. He's explaining to us that God gave us this in order to woo us. Namely, if God simply said, when you get married, you're stuck, there is no way out, then the law might be too much of a challenge for even Israel to accept. So God is saying, all right, this is not really what I want, but I'm going to do something in order to allow you to the ability to follow my law. Why would God do such a thing? Because most marriages back then were not chosen by the person, they were arranged. So could you imagine going to your parents and saying, pick me a husband or pick me a bride, right? I talked to my wife, or not my wife, my mom, about that. We were engaging in that when I was in high school and college, and we were talking a little bit about dating and courtship and arranged marriages and all that stuff. And my mother took one look at me and she said this to me: I would never pick your spouse because I don't want to be responsible for the fallout. Right? Because what might I say if all of a sudden my mom and my dad picked my spouse and we didn't get along? You did it. You did this to me, right? We're so easy to blame other people for the problems that we have, right? And my mom was like, honestly, I'm so glad it is totally up to you. And so I knew from that point on, yep, I'm going to try to find my wife. I'm going to try to find a winner. But if people were stuck into these loveless, unhappy marriages, it might be so grating to them that they would just say, you know what? I'm done with this whole law thing. If I'm trapped here and I have to obey God with all of these problems in my life, screw it, I'm out. Forget God. This is too hard. Not realizing that they're destroying their eternity by making such a decision. So what did God do? God recognized the problem in our heart, our fickleness, our desire not to obey him. And God said, okay, this is not really my best, but I'm going to permit you to get divorced. I'm going to allow it. It's kind of like giving a child candy. Is candy good for them? No, of course not. All that sugar, processed sugar, right? And especially when you give a child a young candy, right? Now they get hyper and they're running around, and they're just bouncing off the walls, and you're just like, oh, right? No, candy is not good. But why then do we give candy? Why then might I, especially when I taught kids, have a bag o' candy? Why? To bribe them. I want you to memorize God's word. Here's a piece of candy if you do. Right? I know it's not good for them. Everybody knows it's not good for them. But the child wants it, so the child will do what I want to do if I give them a little candy. So God gave Israel some emotional candy. All right, you're in a tough spot. I get it. You can get divorced. It's not really the best option, but all right. That's what God was doing. It's not because he wanted it. And this is the key. Remember this phrase. Permission from God is not always endorsement from God. God sometimes allows you to do something, but it doesn't mean he's endorsing it. Right? This didn't really happen, but there's an old myth of a atheist who would stand up and he would teach a philosophy class, and everybody knew that the myth says it was like at UCLA or some prestigious school, that he knew that at the end of class, his whole goal was to try to show the class that God didn't exist. At the end of class, he would say, is there anyone who still believes in God? And everybody knew what was going to happen the moment he said that. If anyone dared to say yes, then he would say, you fool. If you believe in God, and he would pick up a piece of chalk, if you believe in God, then God would not allow me to drop this chalk and let it break on the floor. He would stop it in order to prove his existence. And of course, the professor would drop the chalk and it would break, and he would say, see, God didn't stop me. God didn't stop this. Now, the way that the myth goes is that there was a student who said, I want to stand at the end of the semester. Lord, give me the strength to stand, and can you please stop that professor from breaking that chalk so that people might know your God? And so the story goes that the student prayed that the entire semester. He got to the very end. The professor did his lecture. Is there anyone who still thinks that there is a God? And this student, without missing a beat, stood up. And the professor said, you fool. And he reached for the chalk, as everybody knew he would do. He picked it up in the air and he said, if God exists, then he would. And before the words finished getting out of his mouth, the professor juggled the chalk. It slipped, hit him in the chest, rolled down his leg, onto his shoe, and onto the floor, remaining unbroken. The professor was so shocked, he ran out of the class, allowing the student to go down and share his testimony to the entire philosophy class. God was permitting the professor to do it. It doesn't mean he was endorsing it. He was permitting him to do that so that at some point he could really show the professor that he existed. Permission is not endorsement. Sometimes my children will ask me to do something, and they know that I don't really want them to do it when this is what I do. Okay. But, right? They know I'm allowing it, but they know I don't like it. And I'm usually doing things in order to try to protect them from the dangers that I possibly see with them engaging in some kind of behavior. Permission does not equal endorsement. And the man got it right. Moses permitted a bill of divorce. But that never meant God was endorsing divorce. What was God doing? Just because God allowed divorce does not mean he wanted it. So what was God's intent for marriage? Jesus explains it. Why is divorce not part of God's plan? Because permission to get divorce in the Old Testament did not mean that God supported divorce. Okay? Jesus explains, but from the beginning of time, he created male and female. And because of this, man will leave his father and mother and cling towards his wife, and the two will be into one flesh, so that neither is two but one. What is Jesus doing? He is quoting Genesis 2. He is taking the Pharisees back before the law and telling them this was God's plan. What was God's plan? A man would see a woman. A man would decide that he wanted to marry that woman, whether it was the parents deciding upon it or the man deciding upon it. But when the man married the woman, God's design was he would leave his family. He would take his wife into his life and make a new family with her. And the two would become one. They wouldn't be two, they would be one. That one, the word for that is ehad. The word is the same word that God uses about himself. When he says the Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Elohim, Yahweh Ehad, Hear, O Israel, the Lord, Elohim, is Yahweh, right? That Yahweh is the Lord. Yahweh is one, meaning united. Not just a sole individual, but a plurality that is working together as one. Not two, one. That is the intent for marriage. That you are united to each other. That you work together for the good of your home. And, contrary to much of what happens throughout Asia, you separate a little bit from your clan. The man's supposed to leave his father and mother, not the woman join father and mother in their home. Interesting. Do you know the Jews were very serious about this? In fact, when the husband wanted to get married, do you know what his first task was? Before they got married, he had to build a house. He had to build a separate house for he and his wife. And that they were not married until that house was done. And he could give his wife a house, and the wife could then give him a home. Make sense? That's what was supposed to happen. It's not often what happened, but that was God's intent. It was his plan from the beginning, that marriage was to be this union of a new, special family. Men separate from their family. Men unite with their wife. Think of it a little bit like a graduation, right? A lot of you here have experienced some form of graduation. Okay, many of you have graduated from junior high and you've gone into high school. Some of you have graduated from high school and gone into college. Others of you have graduated college and gone into the workforce. Some of you have even graduated and got into grad school. And some of you have graduated from grad school and gone on to other pursuits like jobs, like marriage, like a family. When you graduate, do you go back? Do I graduate from high school and be like, yes, I finished? You know what? I think I need a little bit of a refresher on Algebra 2. No. You leave high school alone and you go on to something new. When you graduate college, do you go back? Some of us. But hopefully not to college. but to other degrees, grad school and the like, right? Those people that never leave college, we refer to them as professional students. And that's not a very good occupation. You end up with a whole lot of debt with that one, right? You don't go back because you've graduated. You've taken a step. That's what graduation means. You've gone beyond. And even if something horrible happened, like with my graduation, when it's finally said and done, you're done. You might say, Pastor Daniel, what happened at your graduation? Oh, let me tell you. It was awful. My senior year of college, I did what was called an honors thesis. What was an honors thesis? The honors thesis was I spent the first half of the year researching a topic. My major was history. So I spent a whole semester researching something that I wanted to talk about in history. Namely, I wanted to talk about the first and second Great Awakenings in the United States. And I wanted to find out why their theology was so similar to each other. So I worked and I researched and I researched and I worked a whole half of the year. The second half of the year that I was supposed to graduate, I spent writing that paper. It was more than 50 pages that I was writing, and I had to submit that paper at the end in order to graduate. So the semester was running out. I had been working on the paper the entire semester. It was the day before the paper was due. I was making the final edits on my computer. Back then, I know some of you have no idea what I'm talking about because you've grown up in the world of flash drives and hard drives. And we had floppy disks, okay? We had these little disks that you put into a little drive, and it made the computer make noises. The computer was writing on those. You remember those, adults? Right? Remember those things you wrote on that? So I had one of those. I put one of those into my computer, and I hit save. And there was a chip in the computer motherboard that was loose. And it sent a surge throughout my entire computer and wiped out everything. The bibliography, the backup disk, the hard drive, everything gone. 50 pages. It's as if it never existed. And people ask me, Pastor Daniel, what happened to you when you did that? I cried. I lost a year of my life. I went to my dad, begging my dad, who was a wizard at computers and technology, to see if he could help me. He took my backup disk. This is how bad the short was. He took my backup disk into his computer to see if he could salvage anything, and that disk wiped out his computer. It was demonically possessed. I went to the IT at the school. And they were like, well, didn't you make a backup copy? Yes! And it's destroying everything. Right? Well, do you have hard copies? I had some. I had 20 pages that I submitted earlier to the professor for evaluation. That's it. We were working on the last half when all of this happened. And I went in to my professor that next day after just having one of the worst nights I've ever had. And I said, my computer ate my homework. And he said, what happened? And I explained the story. And he said, technology is both our salvation and the bane of our existence. He said, I'm sorry. What can we do? He knew I'd been working on it. I've been checking in with him every week. He said, what can I do? I don't have a paper. I have to graduate. He said, I can give you an extension. So we went to the school and I asked for an extension and I graduated. I walked with everybody, but the summer of my graduation, I had to finish writing that paper. And I had 1 month to turn in a restored version. But I did it. I did it. Paper was a little bit different, honestly, but it was done. And I was so thankful that when someone asked me, are you going to go to grad school? I said, no, I am done. No more school for a while. After that experience, And so I went and I worked. I worked for about 6 years, a little bit more, 6.5, in order to get up enough desire to want to go to school again that I could do well in grad school. But I was over it. I had graduated. Marriage is supposed to be like that. It's supposed to be where you, as a loving son, say, you know what, I'm now going to be married. I'm going to graduate from my family. I'm going to take a step out in order to make a new family with my beloved spouse and create a unity that is going to last a lifetime. Then what about this divorce? Why is divorce not part of God's plan? Jesus first indicated to us that just because God permitted it did not mean that God endorses it. But the second step is he wanted to tell us the plan was marriage from the beginning. Marriage is one of only 3 things that God ever ordained to be one of his creations on this earth, his structures on the earth. Marriage, Jesus says in 10:9, was God's unity, not man's unity, God's unity. And so he says in 10 verse 9, which then God joined together, man must not separate. When God made Adam and Eve, and God created Eve to be this special helper for Adam, God created and ordained the family. When men constantly went astray, and God had to wipe out all of humanity and left one family in Genesis chapter 9, God then ordained and created government to be his representative to punish the wicked and reward the righteous. And then when we get to the New Testament, God creates specially for all of us to understand and grow in him, the church. Those are the 3 institutions that God specifically made and God specifically ordained. And what was the highest, best, first one that God creates? The family. And that's why it's so under attack. That's why in today's day and age, our culture is just hammering the family. No-fault divorce is on the rise. Oh, it doesn't matter. If you just can't live with each other, just break it off. Maybe it's even better from, some psychologists are saying, for the children. They don't have to hear argument in the home. That's not true. Oh, let's just give all of the children to the mother because she's the nurturer and she'll be a better provider for the children. That's not always true. Our society is constantly attacking men. Do you know that I'm sure I've told you this, but let me remind you if you forgot, let me tell you if I hadn't, that the American Psychiatric Association declared just this last year that biblical masculinity was toxic masculinity. And it led Jordan Peterson to say, I'm ashamed of being part of the American Psychiatric Association. Because they're lying to you. Because they want to attack the family. Because the society is evil. And the family is the bedrock to all other institutions. Do you think we're going to have a stable government without stable families? No way. Do you think we're going to have a stable church without stable families? No way. So that's where Satan can attack. And the very chief, the very best, the fastest way to knock me down and get me on my back, wondering how in the world am I going to go through, is to make someone attack either my kids or my wife. And if they're hurting, you better believe I'm hurting. It's the easiest way to lay me out. attack there. I can be finished in a heartbeat. That's why I have to protect my kids. That's why I have to protect my wife so much. And I will die on that hill to try to defend my family. Because God created that union, not me. And what he creates, I have no right to mess with. So divorce was never part of the plan. It was never a desire for God. It was always to remain united. Here's the key. Till death do us part. But I know marriage is hard. And I know for some of you, that became a goal. I hope one of us dies soon. That's sad. But that marriage is supposed to be God's best way of refining you. And you are God's best way of refining your spouse. Why is divorce not part of the plan? Because permission from God is not endorsement. The plan is marriage from the very beginning. Marriage was always supposed to be a divine union. That's why Jesus so boldly declared God's intent on marriage to those Pharisees who were just looking to start a fight. And then the disciples end up asking him privately, what do you mean? Divorce is never part of the plan? We have to stay married? I have to get a new microphone. Divorce is never part of the plan? Are you kidding me? Really, Jesus? Jesus told those disciples, Jesus told those disciples, hey, if you marry someone and then you divorce her and you marry another, it's like you're committing adultery with her. If she marries you, gets divorced, and marries another, it's like she's committing adultery with you. Now, a lot of people treat this very harshly, and they make this direct comparison that marriage, divorce, and then remarriage is adultery. Thinking through this over and over again, I've come to the conclusion I disagree. Here's what I think Jesus is saying to these disciples. Adultery and divorce both destroy a family. That's why God doesn't want it. If I were to go out and cheat on my wife, that would be something she would have the hardest time forgiving me. It would rip her apart and therefore also rip our family apart. It would create such distrust, such a divide, that in the Old Testament, I should be put to death for doing something like that. The punishment in the Old Testament of adultery was a death sentence. Divorce is doing the same thing. It's ripping apart a family. It's creating a seed of distrust and division that now puts child right in the middle of this intense, horrible nightmare of an experience. This one woman I knew, she came from a divorced family, and not only was her parents divorced, but her parents remarried and then divorced again. And so she knew the pain of a broken home. And she confessed to me one day, and I'll never forget her confession to me. She said, you know what? When I was a kid, having lived through divorce twice, now 3 times, my parents getting divorced and then they marrying somebody else, and then both of them getting divorced. It was always my dream at some point that all of us, my mom, my dad, their other wives and ex-wives and ex-husbands, somehow could live all together in harmony. because she knew what disharmony looked like. And she felt that even though her parents didn't get along, that ripping apart was the worst thing that could ever happen to her family. It destroys families, just like adultery destroys families. So that's why God says, I created the family because I love the family, because it's the best way to create and nurture children and refine and develop people. I want solid homes. So don't break it apart. Hold on to it. Protect it with everything you have. Because that's God's goal. So why then did he speak out against divorce? Because it was never part of his plan. And Jesus recognized that committing a divorce is creating the same type of damage that happens when you commit adultery. Again, I know that there are many of you who are struggling with this. You have family members who are struggling with this. This is not to say you're bad. You're just like me. You're just like my family. My brother married someone a month after I married my wife. He stayed together with her for 7 years. And then they got a divorce. And they have been in the process of divorce for the last 10 years. My brother has been in the process of divorce longer than he has been married. It's destroyed him, his daughter, his relationship with his ex-wife, had impacts on my parents and me and my children. I know it hurts. I don't look at him with anything other than empathy. And that's all I look upon you if you're suffering through the same thing. Divorce is awful. That's why God never wanted it. But he knew our hearts. He permitted it. Not endorsing it. But he wanted us to be unified, to encourage unity, so that we could grow a healthy family that God ordained and brought together. So if you are thinking about getting a divorce, come talk to me. Let me share with you a little bit of my family story and to convince you of God's best plan to stay together. If you're struggling because your parents got divorced, or maybe you are divorced, there's no judgment here. You're welcome here because I understand the pain. And we as a church want to walk with you through that pain. We love you. We want God's best for you. But divorce isn't it. So let us as a church vow together. Let's keep marriage sacred. Let's pray. If you are at all struggling with this sermon, I get it. But I want to encourage you, read through what I said, or read through what the Bible said, and really ask yourself, am I saying what Jesus said? Or am I saying something different? If you honestly believe I'm saying something different than what Jesus said, feel free not to listen. Feel free to say, no, Pastor Daniel, I disagree. I think you missed the mark. But if you're struggling because this is what God said, that family is sacred, and God always wanted it to stay united together. If you're struggling, it means that God is trying to say something to you, and your heart is having a hard time accepting it. Ask yourself, ask God, what do you want me to do? How do I still stay soft to your voice? How do I still focus upon what you want rather than upon what I want? How do I submit myself to your truth rather than following the traditions of the culture? And if you are struggling in your marriage, you're not alone. You don't have to struggle alone. There is help here. Let's pray. Lord, you wanted families to be united. You wanted us to stay together. But we struggle because we're sinful. Because I do things that hurt my wife, and my wife does things that hurt me. And our children only make things more complicated at times. But you always wanted unity. You always wanted a sacred, holy marriage. So, Lord, may we promote that in this church. May we encourage that in this church. May we long for that in this church. And when there is a divorce, may it grieve us because it grieves you, but may we support the people who are hurting in the midst of it. And Lord, may we be people that seek not to pull apart what you have established, but to try to, with your help, find healing, find grace, find wisdom in order so that the family can be that stable unit in the church, that the family can be the stable unit in our nation. And so that we as a church can be different from the world around us, not prone to the same type of divorce rates, but trying to follow you with the very best of our ability in all things, even when it's hard. We love you, Lord. We ask you to be the king of this church, the guide of our walk with you. And may we follow your plan, especially when it's hard. We pray for your strength and endurance to do so. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.